Coming to you from Studio A here at Proven Winners Color Choice Shrubs. It's time for the Gardening Simplified radio, YouTube, and podcast show with Stacy Hervella. Me, Rick Weist, and our engineer and producer, Adriana Robinson. Like all birds, hummingbirds have basic habitat requirements, including food, water, shelter, and space to forage and breed in order to thrive. And we all love to see hummingbirds playing in our yards and our landscape and our space. And we want to try to attract these, I'm going to call them pugnacious birds. Small but packing a punch. It's no stretch that synonyms for pugnacious are fitting. Bellicose, chippy, feisty, even gladiatorial. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. And Stacy, they are evidence, however, that there is a direct correlation between the health and diversity of your landscape and the wildlife that it attracts.
Oh, I love that. That's always good to hear.
Beautiful and colorful. Coming up on today's show, suggested hummingbird attracting plants and interviews with nationally recognized hummingbird experts Alan Chartier and Sherry Williamson, author of A Field Guide to Hummingbirds of North America. With us on our live line to kick things off is our very own Birdman, Bill Stovall. And Bill, we've talked recently about bird houses and nesting and that sort of thing, but hummingbirds aren't necessarily interested in a house. They like to live out on the limb, and they're travelers, aren't they?
That's a fact. Yes, they make a little nest up on a flat spot on a limb, often on a white pine limb, and that's where I've seen them. And they're the prettiest little nests. They just a little tiny thing. They make them out of spider webs and out of lichens and out of little bits of fluff they find. And the inside of the nest is about the size of a quarter.
Wow.
Really small.
Yeah, you're so right, Bill, because I had read somewhere the eggs of the hummingbird are no bigger than, let's say, the size of a navy bean. And that soft, almost expandable nest using spider webs, lichens, as Bill had mentioned. Stacy, I think many people have never seen a hummingbird nest.
Well, they're deliberately very careful about where they put it because they are so little and they don't have a lot of defenses. So they're not going to, dive bomb you like the famous red-winged blackbirds of Grand Rapids defending their nest. So they need to be very sneaky about it.
Oh, and talk about travel, Bill. Migration. You take the ruby-throated hummingbird found in the eastern U.S., crossing the Gulf of Mexico every year. It migrates between overwintering sites in central Mexico and summer breeding grounds in the eastern U.S. And then you take the rufous hummingbird that travels thousands of miles. And I mean thousands of miles. Think about overwintering in Mexico and spending your summers in Alaska. Unbelievable the territory these birds cover.
That's amazing too. They binge before they go. They double their weight.
Wow!
So that they have enough energy to make it go. They just eat and eat and eat, and all of a sudden they can fly those long distances without stopping.
Wow!
So they fly without stopping. So they don't stop in Southern California or the flower fields of Central California for a little break on the way.
Oh, they could. I mean, it's a good spot, but they're not starved. They've got plenty of energy to get there.
That's amazing.
One interesting thing I've observed with hummingbirds is that they, of course, feed by day on nectar from flowers. So we're talking about annuals and perennials, trees, shrubs, vines. But also insects are important to hummingbirds, fruit flies, gnats. I've even heard of hummingbirds consuming tree sap. Am I correct in that, Birdman?
A good portion of the protein they get is from the insects. So that's a big factor. 30 to 40% of their diet is little insects, but all your plants, of course, attract all these little insects too.
You look at the data on hummingbirds and how fast their heart races and their wings flap. They have to have some high energy fuel to be able to function.
Well, they have to have high energy fuel because it seems to me at times they only eat so they can get enough energy to fight off their predators. Or not their predators, but their competitors. They're each other.
Right.
I mean, they pack a lot of rage into those little bodies.
Yes, they do. Pugnacious, right? And Bill, the best way to support hummingbirds and other pollinators in your area, of course, is to plant nectar plants. But this is interesting. Some scientists suggest the presence of feeders may impact natural pollination of plants, alter hummingbird behavior. There are other people who say, no. Feeders help bolster hummingbird populations by counteracting the loss of forage and habitat caused by human activity. I guess there's some debate on this matter.
I'm in camp number 2 very strongly because when the hummingbirds come back, sometimes there isn't enough blossom availability, but they can start with sugar water until the insects increase and the flowers increase to maintain their health. So it's a twofold area, and it's so simple, and it also helps people recognize the birds and have the entertainment of having them in their side yard in front of the window. And that encourages them to plant things that'll keep them in the yard.
No, absolutely. Seeing them and starting to appreciate them really is the first step to, conservation and making sure that you are doing the right thing. And, I find I have a combination of both as well. I have a lot of plants that attract hummingbirds in bloom, from spring until fall, and a bunch of feeders. And I'll tell you, when they visit the yard, they make use of both. Oh, yeah. They're not just like one or the other. They're browsing the buffet. They're coming up to the dessert table. They're doing it all.
Yeah, and if you think about it, we talked about diversity in the landscape. Sure, nectar flowers in the landscape, but they want trees in order to build their nests. There's certain plants that they want to help build their nests, like lamb's ear is a plant in the landscape that I've heard hummingbirds use. So again, Bill, diversity in the landscape is probably going to help attract these beautiful birds to your yard.
That's a fact.
Now,
and, this is a international show, so the ruby throats are basically east of the Mississippi, but there are 15 species west of the Mississippi, particularly in the southwest. And there are places there are centers where they just put up these beautiful gardens and these sugar water feeders, and they're just flooded with many species of the hummingbird at the same time. It's amazing.
Many different species, you are correct. And we'll talk to Sherry Williamson about that also. Birdman, in summer, sometimes people will send me pictures or video of this cool hummingbird that they saw in their landscape. In reality, it wasn't a hummingbird at all. It was a moth, right?
A sphinx moth, yes. They're a wonderful little thing. They're gorgeous. And they'll show up, and they just buzz around, and they're just cute as can be. So, but they're not a bird.
No, but they can. I feel like I'm a good bird observer, and I have been momentarily thrown by a clear-wing moth or a sphinx moth, because they kind of hover and browse plants, and of course the same plants the hummingbirds would, in the same way. And you experience that with the right person, they're not even going to believe you that it wasn't a bird.
Well, they're the ecological gap between hummers, or the gap between birds and bees, because they do an awful lot of pollinating while they're doing getting their sap.
Definitely.
Absolutely. Birdman, as I mentioned, coming up on the show, Sherry Williamson and the North American Guide to Hummingbirds, Peterson's Guide. You had a chance to meet Mr. Peterson.
Yes, more than once. And he was a very high energy guy, a big man, and just bubbled with enthusiasm. He's a fabulous artist, and his research on his first book, which was 1939, 1947, 1967, was the original Bible of birding, and it had a lot to do. There was a lot about hummingbirds in that.
So it's easy to say he was one of your inspirations as a birder, as a naturalist, as somebody who enjoys and loves conservation in the landscape, probably one of your influences.
Well, I grew up in Western New York, which is real close to Cornell, and we had a lot of Cornell people and he was from Chautauqua Lake and area, and it was kind of a birding center where I came from, and so it was a lot of fun to have several mentors there in my Hamburg, New York area to help me on this path. So I've been doing birding ever since I was a little kid.
Oh, that's fantastic. Birdman, we appreciate you. Thanks for getting us started today. It's going to be the big Hummingbird Show, and coming up next, Stacy and I will share with you some favorites that we use to attract hummingbirds to our landscape. That's coming up next here on the Gardening Simplified Show.
Greetings, gardening friends, and welcome back to the Gardening Simplified Show, the Hummingbirds Simplified Show. If you can simplify them, they are quite complex and fascinating creatures. And, you know, I think one thing that is truly amazing about hummingbirds that a lot of people don't realize is that they are only found in the Americas. Oh. So if you are abroad, if you're in another country, you will not see hummingbirds.
Interesting.
There are some similar-ish birds in other tropical countries. But for the most part, they are uniquely ours. And they're one of those plants that if you ever are looking at like birding groups online, on Facebook or forums, you know, that's like when people from Europe come to the U.S., that's what they hope to see is a hummingbird.
Lucky us.
Right? And
they have starlings, we have hummingbirds.
Right. So like the ruby-throated hummingbird for us is just like, you know, such a lifer for them, such a bird that they would truly desire to see. And so I always think, you know, especially in later summer when they're going bananas in my yard, just like, oh, if only one of those people could just like come in here and just see how wonderful they are. And so I think it's important that we don't lose sight of how amazing it is that we have them, especially in the north. You know, it's one thing, of course, in the Southwest, where the climate is much more amenable with year-round food. We don't have that. But it is plants on trial. So, of course, we're talking about plants and hummingbirds. And I grow a huge diversity of plants. I mean, one of my main criteria for adding a plant to my garden is, does it, you know, somehow support insects or birds?
Sure.
So a lot of plants that I happen to have do actually. So I've seen the hummingbirds recently visiting my Nepeta, my cat's meow Nepeta. They are loving that. Sampling all sorts of other things. All my annuals I specifically buy for hummingbirds. So, you know, to me, that's a good way to like get my money's worth out of them.
And again, diversity.
Yeah.
This morning, yes, I saw hummingbirds at my Nepetas in the backyard. So
yeah, they're having a great old time.
They're having a great old time.
They eat heuchera. They feed on heuchera flowers, which a lot of people, you know, they think heuchera, oh, that foliage plant. If you have a good one for flowering, they love the flowers on heuchera. And I didn't believe that would be the case since they're so close to the ground, you know, the heuchera flowers.
Sure.
But I have seen it myself, and I can attest. And, you know, when I was thinking about what plants to put on trial today, I had a couple. I mean, we have many different shrubs that attract hummingbirds and sustain hummingbirds through the season. But I was thinking about an experience I had 2 weeks ago. I was staying with some friends in Ann Arbor, and they have kind of a unique landscape where their house is like a split level. And so you look down onto sort of a cavernous driveway, and they have all these cascading plants coming over their driveway. And I was looking out the window, and there were some weigela down there that were absolutely mobbed with hummingbirds.
Wow.
Now, that shouldn't really be surprising because weigela have all the trademark characteristics of being a good hummingbird food plant. Trumpet-shaped flowers, that kind of pink-red color family typically, although there are some white varieties out there. But I had never really seen them like making so much use out of the weigela. And I thought,
I can see it.
Yeah, I can see it. And I thought, well, why don't I have a weigela? Because this is kind of great. And when you are thinking about, you know, adding a weigela, it's important to think about these spring flowering plants, you know, like Birdman was just saying, that you need to have food sources for them from when they arrive here in Michigan. That's usually late April, like the last week of April or thereabouts. You know, and especially then it's important because it's cold and they need to refuel after their long journey. So we need plants that, you know, sometimes all the summer stuff gets all the credit, you know, like your cannas, of course, for us not blooming until summer. So it's really good when you're thinking about this diversity. It's not just a diversity of plant types, it's a diversity of bloom times.
And for people keeping score at home, when I drove up to the studio today, Stacy, the weigela were just in full bloom and gorgeous.
Yes.
Here in Michigan right now.
Yep, they are an absolute peak bloom. And so they're such a great choice for that. And when I was thinking about which of our weigela to put on trial today, I decided on Snippet Dark Pink Weigela, and I picked this one for two main reasons. I mean, we've already established Weigela are great for hummingbirds, but I picked this particular one for two main reasons. Number one, it is a reblooming Weigela.
Okay.
So it's going to bloom now along with all the other Weigela, and then it's going to take a little bit of a break and put on more new growth. And in that period, as much new growth as it puts on, it will be able to create additional flowers on to bloom throughout summer.
Fabulous.
So with a reblooming Weigela like Snippet Dark Pink or our Sonic Bloom series, you're getting that much longer window of a food source without really having to do anything or take up more space or anything like that. So that's one thing I really like in terms of finding a Weigela to accommodate hummingbirds. And then the second one is, as you may guess by that name, Snippet Dark Pink. This is a very small Weigela. And some older Weigelas, they get really large. And so people, I think, a lot of times they have a nostalgic connection to Weigela, but they're thinking of like, their grandma's Weigela when they were growing up, which they were probably like 2.5 feet tall at the time. So the thing seemed extra big. And B, the older varieties were legitimately quite large.
Large, woody, flopping over, intimidating.
Right. So Snippet Dark Pink reaches just 1 to 2 feet tall and wide. So this is a Weigela that if you're looking for ways to attract hummingbirds and you're short on space, say you have a condo, an apartment, a balcony, something like that, this is a plant that is going to take up very little space, but give you a lot of bang for your buck. And of course, the flowers have that nice dark pink color. Many of us know that hummingbirds are more attracted to like the red, dark pink color range, although they're not particularly picky. We were just talking about them being on Nepeta, which is bluish purple. And so it's a great choice, I think, for all of those characteristics to just kind of tuck into your garden. You want to put it in full sun, like most Weigela. It is a full sun plant. And then just sit back and watch the hummingbirds come by.
You sold me. I'm going to add Snippet to my landscape. Now, again, we've talked about this a number of times already today, diversity. And, favorite hummingbird plants. Weigela, you're right, absolutely has to be on that list. Do you have a couple of other really go-tos that you really think this one, I think Kufia is one.
Yeah,
right?
I love my Kufia. And Vermillionaire Kufia from Proven Winners is one that I have to grow every year because of the hummingbirds. They don't, so I put those right on either side of my back door. And they don't tend to feed at them quite a lot until later in the season. And then they're just like, they're just crazed for food.
Sure.
And so in that case, then I see them a lot. But it's still, just because I don't see them doesn't mean that they're not there. So Kufia is a must-have for me. Any kind of salvia. And I know you're a salvia person, too.
Salvia, big time. Looking forward to 2025. Unplugged red salvia. Dynamic cultivar of our native scarlet sage. Looking forward to this Proven Winners plant. But any of the unplugged or rockin' series of salvias from Proven Winners. And then, of course, yes, Stacy, I am the canna king, and cannas are my go-to for hummingbirds.
Well, talk about a red flower.
Exactly.
There are cannas with other flowers, but the classic one that you have, that red flower, is irresistible to them, and it's nice and tall. And I think that having that height difference, having a lot of different heights is also good for them. I'm always surprised to see them get so close to the ground, but they're still going to be very cautious about predators or, anything like that. So they do also tend to like plants that flower a little bit higher in the sky. I am actually trying a new annual this year. I don't know if you're familiar with it, Hummingbird Falls Salvia. And this is what they're calling a hanging basket salvia.
I've never grown it.
So instead of growing upright like other salvias, it's actually cascading. Nice. And so you do see it in hanging baskets. I did not get it in a hanging basket. I just got like a standalone 1 gallon that I'm going to put into a container in my hummingbird garden. I'm very excited to try that. And, this isn't a plant, but I did something almost life-changing this weekend. A small thing, almost life-changing.
Whoa.
Can't yet speak to...
Breaking news here on the Gardening Simplified show. Let's hear it.
I can't yet speak to how it's going to affect the hummingbirds, but my mom was showing me this video of a woman who lives out in California and creates all these wacky solar fountains for hummingbirds, and they love to bathe in them. And so I had this bird feeder, or this bird bath that I loved, but it was really deep and not convenient for the birds because it was too deep. They couldn't get in it. I tried putting rocks. It was a pain to clean. I bought a solar bird bath fountain. And all you do is you fill up the bird bath and you put this thing in there. And like, even as soon as I took it outside, it's just like, it's like, whoa, sun, I'm going. It has all these different little nozzles that you can put on it. It is amazing. Now, I just put this up over the weekend, last weekend. So
I'm placing my order right now.
So
here.
I haven't been able to say for sure because it takes them some time. And this is true if you put up, a feeder or anything like that. It takes some time to feel comfortable.
Sure.
They stake it out for a bit first. But I'm pretty confident that this is going to be a hummingbird game changer. And even if it isn't, honestly, it's a lot of fun. We were playing around with the nozzles, changing them out. And as long as it's sunny, you're good to go.
So between the bird bath and the unplugged red salvia for 2025, wow.
Yeah, the garden's getting decked out. It is getting decked out for the hummingbirds. Yeah, and that's what I love too. And you know what? All of these things at the end of the day, they're good for the hummingbirds, but they're good for you too, because it's great to just have a lot of flowers in your yard, not just for the hummingbirds, but for bees and other, insects and things that visit the garden. And then your yard looks better and you feel like a garden rock star. So it's win-win. It's just win all around. So whatever you can do to improve your garden for hummingbirds, whether that is planting snippet dark pink weigela or one of the many proven winners annuals that sustain hummingbirds, or maybe adding a solar fountain to a unused bird bath, it's all good. We're going to take a little break. When we come back, we have got a guest. So please stay tuned.
Welcome back to the Gardening Simplified show. It's our privilege today to be able to talk to Alan Chartier. He is the Michigan Hummingbird Guy. He's been interested in science and nature since he was 5 years old and began bird watching when he was 11. And now that includes, birding trips to 28 countries, has birded in all 50 U.S. states. Alan is an amazing photographer. He's been a bird bander since 1997 and a hummingbird bander since 2000 when he began the Great Lakes Hummer Net Research Project. Alan, it's a privilege and a pleasure to have you on the Gardening Simplified show.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Alan, can you start off by talking to our listeners and our viewers about bird banding, specifically hummingbirds, why it's important, and give us an idea of what that process is like?
Well, I'll try to be brief. Bird banding is a research tool that has been used for well over 100 years. It started with banding of waterfowl. And it helped to work out the migration corridors of migrating ducks and geese. And the hunters would shoot the birds, and the numbers would get recorded. And so you'd find out where the bird was banded, where it was shot, and piece together their migration routes. It's come a long way since then, but it still is basically an aluminum ring or band placed on a bird's leg, with a unique number on it, so that when it's found one way or another, either shot as in a duck or recaptured as in maybe another hummingbird bander on the Gulf Coast or Texas, that number can be reported back to the U.S. Geological Survey's bird banding lab. And this is a highly regulated activity that requires a lot of training. You have to have valid research project in order to become a bird bander. And there are probably the ducks and geese and things, that's all kind of DNRs and Fish and Wildlife does that. But songbirds, there's maybe 2,000 or 3,000 of us across North America that do different kinds of projects with songbirds. And there's only about 100 of us who do hummingbirds because it requires a special permit beyond the regular songbird permit and special training. And there are different reasons for that, but it's, they're small. A lot of it has to do with the fact that they're very small birds. And safety is priority one with all of these research projects. You want to make sure that, if you're going to put a band on a bird to learn something about it, that their birds are not harmed or in any way, or there's no detrimental effect. So you want to figure out their longevity and their migration routes and things like that. So, being highly trained to be as safe as possible is all part of the process.
And just how tiny is a band for a hummingbird?
So I do PowerPoint programs for garden clubs and bird clubs, and I have a PowerPoint presentation showing one of these bands on the tip of my finger. And that's really the best way to see how small they are. So, if I tell you that the bands are roughly 2 millimeters in diameter and 1.4 millimeters tall. That sounds small, but when you see it on my finger in a photo, it's really, really small. A band that we put on a chickadee is like 8 times bigger.
Wow. That's amazing.
And the bands are, for songbirds, come to us in envelopes in strings of 100 on a wire, and they're stamped and curled into a ring. The hummingbird bands come to us on a flat sheet. We have to cut them out with special tools and file them down and cut them to size. So we actually have to make them versus, that's where the special training comes in. So you need to have really good close vision, which I've been nearsighted since I've worn glasses since I was 8 years old. And so working with tiny things has been kind of second nature to me, but you have to make the bands so that they're the right size. They won't be too tight or too large and slip off, and no sharp edges and all that stuff. So, but yeah, they're very tiny. People often ask me, how much do they weigh? My scale weighs to the 10th of a gram, and I don't know. I put one on and it registers 0. Other people are telling me they weigh like 8 milligrams or something like that, so like 8,000ths of a gram. So they're very, very light, don't impede the bird's movement or flight in any way. And all the other bands for all the other birds are also generally made out of aluminum, except for, in some cases, like cardinals have a really powerful bite. They have to use stainless steel bands for some of those birds because they can just smash the aluminum with their beaks.
Interesting.
We're talking to Alan Chartier, and he is the Michigan Hummingbird guy. Now, the link to his website, we're going to put that at our website, gardeningsimplifiedonair.com. And those of you watching on YouTube, you can see some of that information on your screen also, because there are links there that describe some of this work that Alan does, as well as incredible pictures that he takes from northern flickers to tree swallows and yellow warblers on his Flickr account. That link is there on his account also. Important work that you do with banding, Alan. For our listeners and our viewers, someone who has a backyard, loves flowers and plants, a word of advice for our listeners as far as hummingbirds are concerned and what you've learned through the years. How can we appreciate them best? How can we support hummingbird populations?
Well, as a hummingbird researcher, I am not home very much. And as a photographer, I really am into wildflowers of all kinds. So I don't have a really good background in gardening because I'm not home long enough to do any of it. But having spoken to lots and lots of garden clubs and familiar with a whole lot of other researchers who work on this, it's good to have a home that is a yard that is a little bit scruffy for wildlife in general. A really manicured spot is not going to be that good for wildlife in general. And I like to promote the nectar sources from flowers, and you can put hummingbird feeders up as well. With the realization that, the hummingbird feeders are mostly for you to be able to see them closer. The nectar sources, I like to promote native plants primarily, although there are a lot of non-native plants that hummingbirds really do like as well. And there's some other plants that are kind of in between. So, for example, the trumpet vine is a very well-known among hummingbird enthusiasts plant. It's got 5-inch long red tubular flowers, and it needs support and full sun, and it grows up on a trellis or a fence really well. But it's not native as far north as Michigan, but it is native to North America. Other plants like hostas are native to Japan, but hummingbirds like them too. And then, of course, all kinds of native species like cardinal flower, columbines, and then verbenas and lobelias and things like that. Turtlehead, wild bergamot, things like that are also very good. A plant that grows in wet places is called jewelweed or spotted touch-me-not, and most people don't put that in the garden because it needs to be wet, but it blooms in fall during the fall migration of hummingbirds, and the hummingbird is an important pollinator of that plant. So keeping all of this in mind is keeping tubular plants are the primary interest to hummingbirds. Generally, they don't like to feed from open flat plants. One exception would be impatiens. People often have impatiens hanging from their porches or and so forth. And the hummingbirds will go to those, and they'll go to petunias as well. But flat plants like daisies tend to have a lot of insects, stinging insects, landing on them. And there's a lot of competition for the hummingbirds. The tubular plants allow the hummingbird to stick its beak in there and have privacy while it licks out that little microliter of nectar. Well, nobody else can get at it. And so they can go in there and visit flower after flower after flower. So the tubular nature of the flower is important. And red is on the hummingbird feeders, but our ruby-throated hummingbirds are not necessarily, don't require red plants. Some of these lobelias are blue or purple. The columbines are red and yellow. The turtle heads, there's white ones. And so the hummingbirds will find the nectar if you put a variety of these kinds of things in your yard. And also try to find things that bloom finding things that bloom in May is difficult in Michigan. But throughout the summer and into the fall, hummingbirds are used to nectar sources coming and going because there's no plant that blooms all growing season long. So if you have things that will replace, when your columbines wither and die out, you've got maybe a verbena or maybe a bergamot coming in later, and then maybe the lobelias, and then maybe even your jewel weeds coming in later. So if you have things that kind of cycle through the season, your hummingbirds will always have some nectar sources. And then, of course, they have a fairly large range. So half a mile to 3/4 of a mile. So they're not just visiting your garden, much as you might like to think that they're your birds. They're going out into the woodlands nearby, and they're finding the native plants out there as well. And they're eating insects too. So insects are also an important part of their diet. So keeping your garden pesticide free is important. Even though you might not want insects, the hummingbirds want them, and they like the tiny flying insects. The pesticides will go into the root system and into the nectar and into the hummingbirds. So you want to avoid doing that too.
Definitely.
Wow, that was incredible. Really well said, and we appreciate that, Alan. We have been talking to Alan Chartier, and if you're interested in learning more, his website is great. Go to it. We have the link at gardeningsimplifiedonair.com or right here on YouTube on your screen. Alan, thank you so much for what you do for birding, and we appreciate your time here on the Gardening Simplified show today.
Oh, sure. I'm glad that you're bringing the message to hummingbird lovers everywhere.
Thank you so much. Welcome back to the Gardening Simplified show. Today, for our branching news segment, we have the privilege to chat with Sherry Williamson. She is a naturalist, ornithologist, conservationist, birder, writer, author, artist. Sherry and her husband and colleague Tom Wood moved to Arizona to work as live-in managers of the Nature Conservancy's Ramsey Canyon Preserve through 1995. So her more recent work has been restoring and managing the gardens at Ash Canyon Bird Sanctuary, a birding hotspot just a few miles from Ramsey. Sherry is the author of a Peterson Field Guide to Hummingbirds of North America. It was originally published in 2002, and she's currently working on a revision of a Field Guide to Hummingbirds for North America. Sherry, thank you so much for joining us on the Gardening Simplified show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
I loved listening to a podcast, an interview that you did when you said, You've mentioned that you consider hummingbirds a gateway drug to nature and conservancy. I love that because I have often said in the garden industry, tomatoes and peppers are the gateway drug to gardening.
Yeah, there are a lot of gateway drugs out there of the good kind.
Yes.
Exactly. So
gardening and birding and conservation are all very wholesome things. So we're glad to have those kinds of gateway drugs in our lives.
Absolutely.
Now, of course, all of the links to Sherry's website and the many things that she does, including her book, you'll find them. We're going to link them to our website, gardeningsimplifiedonair.com. But Sherry, I was reading in your blog, I was fascinated by this. You say, hummingbirds truly are masters of color, creating more hues and iridescence than any other birds combined or all other birds combined. That's quite a statement.
It is, that was the result of a relatively recent study where they analyzed the colors found in birds. And you think about the many, many colors that are produced by pigments, but also the incredible rainbow of colors produced by iridescence. But hummingbirds, they found, have their colors occupy a broader range of the spectrum than any other birds do. And what's even more amazing, though, is that spectrum goes beyond the colors that we humans can see. Mm-hmm. We only have 3 kinds of visual pigments in our eyes. Hummingbirds have 4. And they can see colors into what we consider the ultraviolet, into what we consider the infrared. They have incredible color discrimination. So it kind of makes sense that birds in general, but hummingbirds in particular, would have these incredible ranges of color within their plumage. But hummingbirds, with their mastery of iridescence, they've locked up the title of the most colorful birds on Earth.
Well, they're the only green bird we have here in the north. That's one thing that a truly green bird, which I think says a lot. We have a rainbow of everything else. We got our cardinals, we got our orioles, we got a lot of yellow, but they're really the only true green bird that's not waterfowl that we can enjoy here in the north.
Yeah, green is kind of a hard color to produce. So for most birds, green has to be a combination of a structural blue color combined with a yellow pigment. And the things like, female painted bunting, for example, have that. Green jay down in South Texas and into the tropics have that. But most birds produce those greens, if they have greens at all, by iridescence. And often they're dark greens or more subtle greens, like the green in a green-winged teal, for example. But the hummingbirds, of course, most of our hummingbirds in North America have green on them somewhere. That's one of the common questions we get about hummingbird identification is, I saw this hummingbird in my yard and it had a green back. What kind was it? That doesn't narrow it down much. But green, of course, makes perfect sense for a tiny little bird that has a lot of enemies. Lots of things like to eat hummingbirds, from birds that prey on other birds and mammals that prey on other birds and snakes and stuff, all the way to some large insects, things like praying mantids like to prey on hummingbirds as well. So that green color helps to camouflage them when they're not trying to be conspicuous like males in their courtship displays.
In your studies, Sherry, along that line, in our first segment, I mentioned that I consider hummingbirds to be pugnacious or feisty or chippy. And, of course, the amazing bills on these birds. Can those bills do physical damage? In other words, when they're fighting, is it just belligerent posturing, or are they actually doing physical damage?
Some of that depends on the species of hummingbird we're talking about. That bill is, its main purpose, of course, is to probe flowers to extract nectar. Mm-hmm. And it's full of nerve endings and blood vessels. It's not just like a toothpick or something on the front of their head. It's full of living tissue and very, very sensitive. So it's a little problematic to use something like that as a weapon. However, there are a few tropical hummingbirds that have some adaptations that that weaponize those food probes, basically. Some of the hermit hummingbirds, the males, have sharp little hooks on the tips of their bills, and they'll use those to rip feathers out of each other. They will sometimes poke each other and inflict minor stab wounds, not like, piercing somebody with a rapier or something. But they can do some damage with those bills. And we sometimes, when I'm handling hummingbirds, as we're banding hummingbirds during the studies with the Southeastern Arizona Bird Observatory, which are licensed, permitted by the bird banding laboratory of the U.S. Geological Service. Sometimes I'll come upon birds that have conspicuous bruises or little bits of torn skin on their chest. Not very often, but most of the damage they do is just ripping feathers out of each other. But it certainly is a possibility.
Now, down there in you said southeastern Arizona, how many species of hummingbird are you able to enjoy?
We have 15 species on a semi-regular to very regular basis. We've got about a half dozen breeding species that are quite common and widespread, and a few others that are less common, much less common, but if you know the place to find them, you can find them. And then we also have lots of migrants. That's one of the special things about being where we are, is that we're in that zone where Mexico meets the U.S., where the North meets the South, where the tropics meet the temperate zone, also where the mountains meet the desert. We're a real crossroads of geography and habitat. So we get, Rufus and Calliope hummingbirds as migrants. We occasionally get Allens coming over from California, but we have, as breeding birds, we've got Annas and Costas and black-chinned and broad-billed and broad-tailed and ribbleys and blue-throated mountain gem. Occasionally white-eared hummingbird, occasionally barreline hummingbird.
Now, I have a question. So here in the north, where we really only have ruby throats, and my mom has noticed this too. My mom learned my appreciation for hummingbirds from my mom and my grandparents. So they tend to be very, very territorial. And like you would not, it's very rare that I would see two ruby-throated hummingbirds on any of my feeders at any one time. Like it just doesn't happen. Like they perch and wait to chase each other away. But you can look, on YouTube or Instagram or anywhere and see these videos coming from California, from Arizona, of multiple, hummingbirds just mobbing feeders and mobbing yards. And is that a matter of different species? Is it just that they are more comfortable there? There's less competition for food? What explains that?
Actually, a lot of that can be more competition for food, because when food is scarce, we do see hummingbirds coming to feeders in a lot larger numbers and being more tolerant of one another.
Oh, interesting.
One of the most amazing spectacles of hummingbirds feeding that I ever saw, just in the fact that it was this real peaceable kingdom situation, was in New Mexico at the world famous Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Refuge. It was a summer visit during the breeding season for their resident black-chinned hummingbirds. And it was a very dry year, a really drought-stricken area. Everything was brown and dry, not a lot of flower nectar for the birds. So they were depending, even though the marshes and water impoundments at Bosque provide a lot of insects for the birds to eat, they were depending on feeders for their sugar, for the energy from the sugar, to help power their very active lifestyle, and especially for the females as they were nesting. And their feeders at the visitor center at Bosque, there were often, a dozen or more birds around each feeder. There were birds that were sitting next to one another feeding out of the same feeder port, and sometimes a third bird would come in from above to feed.
Wow.
But these were all females, so they were getting along a lot better than the males do. And the most important thing for each of them, since each of them had young ones depending on them, the most important thing for them was to get that energy, get back to that nest, and take care of their kids. They didn't have time for fighting. No time for fighting. You will see during migration, you will see the females be just as pugnacious and ferocious as the males. But a lot of that territoriality breaks down when resources are scarce. Everybody's dependent on the same, narrow range of resources, and everybody's got that very important business of getting the kids fed and fledged and out on their own.
Now, that reminded me of another question I have. So when hummingbirds have young in the nest, are they feeding them on nectar that they're just like storing somewhere in their mouths or beaks, or do they collect insects for their young? How are they getting food back to their young?
It's both. And like other birds, hummingbirds carry most of the birds carry their food in their crop, which is an expandable part of their esophagus. It performs the storage function of our own stomachs, but it kind of keeps the food outside the bird's main body. So it serves a little bit different different anatomical function in that it's hanging off the bird's neck, basically. If you've ever seen pictures of like African vultures around a zebra kill or something, you see this big fleshy looking bulge on their neck. That's the crop where the food is stored before it goes down into the gizzard and gets processed and ground up, and then into the intestines where all the nutrients are extracted. So when we are looking at these breeding female hummingbirds, they will have often very distended crops, and those crops will be full of insects, but there will also often be nectar in there as well. A lot of it depends on what stage their babies are at. When the babies are very small, they mostly need the nutrition that they're going to get from insects and spiders and other animal foods. They've got to have the proteins, the minerals to build their strong bones, all those little micronutrients of various kinds, the amino acids and all of that, vitamins and all that have to be in their food, their baby food, essentially. So for them to grow on, and they grow so rapidly, they need a lot. But as they get bigger and their little wings start to develop, the feathers start to grow on their wings and start flapping their wings so they can strengthen their muscles and grow their muscles to make it possible for them to take that first flight. Mom is giving them more and more nectar to provide that sugar energy that they need to power that increased metabolism during that later stage of nestling period.
We're chatting with Sherry Williamson. She is the author of a Peterson Field Guide to Hummingbirds of North America and at the Ash Canyon Bird Sanctuary. I want to ask you about that bird sanctuary, Sherry, but prior to that, Stacy had mentioned the ruby-throated hummingbirds here along the lakeshore in West Michigan. Of course, I enjoy a number of them in my landscape. I've always had this imagination in fall of them migrating and traveling over the Gulf of Mexico. And I've often wondered, is that true? Are they traveling across that large expanse of water to get to where they need to go, or do they hug the shoreline? Have any studies been done on that?
Well, actually, the best information we have on that is from just everyday folks that are contributing their sightings to the eBird database. eBird is a project of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and a number of other organizations pooling their resources to create this database that ordinary citizen scientists or community scientists can contribute their sightings to. And when you look at those sightings, the Cornell has literally they've literally mapped the sightings on a date basis. And you can actually watch an animation on their website showing how the birds migrate. And you can see that, in fact, the longstanding idea that they were migrating both directions across the Gulf of Mexico, that's not so much true. Most of those birds that are coming south in August, September, they are coming around the Gulf. There's a number of good reasons for them to do that, including hurricanes and just the fact that the Yucatan Peninsula is kind of a narrow target for them to hit as they come across, whereas when they're coming north in the spring, they can hop from the Yucatan right across and hit land wherever they go. But that's been one of the tremendous values of having just, average birders out there in their backyards or out on trails in nearby parks or on vacation in places like southeastern Arizona, reporting their sightings to eBird so that we have all of that information that we can map and learn more about the travels of birds, what habitats are important to them at different times of year, and just better understand them so we have a better chance of making sure that they continue on to prosper in the future.
And I would imagine that a lot of that information that we are finding out from things like eBird is creating both opportunity and problems for your new edition of the field guide.
Boy, you're right about that. Holy smokes! Oh man, that's something that I spend an awful lot of time looking at the photos that are submitted to eBird. Of course, not every sighting that's submitted to eBird has to be accompanied by a photo. But where folks have submitted photos to eBird, it's very, very good information for me because I can go in, for example, any bird that's difficult to identify. I can go in and if a picture's been submitted, I can look at that picture. Sometimes I can't tell, but sometimes I can see that it's not what they thought it was. And I can contact the folks who manage that database, and they can reassign that bird to a different species, give the bad news to the person who reported it. Or actually, sometimes it's good news. Actually, in California, they had little bird that they thought was a Costas hummingbird visiting a cemetery in a park near the coast. And it turned out that little bird was a ruby-throated, and they got very excited about it because any ruby-throated in California is definitely cause for celebration.
Sure.
Wow. Sherry, can I visit Ash Canyon Bird Sanctuary? Just take a moment to describe
absolutely.
it.
We would love to have you visit sometime. Ash Canyon Bird Sanctuary was the dream and the home of our late friend Mary Jo Ballator. Mary Jo was a passionate gardener. She and her ex-husband had landscaping business together. She was, like me, an enthusiast of salvias. She and I bonded over our mutual love of salvias. But we also bonded over our mutual love of birds as well. In 2002, she opened her yard to the public. This is a longstanding tradition here in Arizona. It's unusual for people to open their yard to birders to come and just sit in their yard and watch their birds. But a few very generous individuals have done so, including Mary Jo. And she unfortunately, she cared for her garden and hosted thousands and thousands of birders from 2002 until the spring of 2019 when she passed away very suddenly. And of course, we were all devastated. But unfortunately, her friends rallied, and one of her dearest friends, Tony Batiste, who runs a little bed and breakfast nearby and another canyon nearby, he was determined not to allow her property to just be sold off and the welcome mat taken in and the feeders taken down, but to preserve it, to keep her dream alive. And thanks to Tony and his connections, we were able to get a substantial donation from the Molina family in California that allowed us to purchase her property, her 6.19 acres of canyon habitat and her home and her garden, and keep it open to the public, to the birding public. And since that time, we've had so much support from the birding community and other nature lovers, providing us with donations that have helped us to add things that Mary Jo would love to have had during her tenure there. We have added rainwater harvesting. We, as much as possible in this very dry climate, we irrigate the gardens with rainwater through a drip system. We added a pond, which is now home to 4 different endangered species, 1 plant and 3 animals, 2 fish and a frog. We have expanded the feeding operation. We have replaced a lot of the flowers and the plants that had died in Mary Jo's garden during the time between her passing and the time we were able to take over ownership and management. That was quite a job in itself, just removing a lot of invasive plants that had taken over the garden and then, doing triage, plants that hadn't survived, getting them out of the ground, getting new plants in the ground. Managing the gopher population has been quite a feat. Mary Jo's took a very live and let live attitude towards the wildlife in her garden. And while she did obviously take steps to manage the damage that the wildlife did to her plants, her beautiful plants, she was not the kind of person that would put out poisons and lethal traps and things like that. So we have been taking that same philosophy to heart and using repellents and fencing, wire baskets to keep the gophers from eating the root systems, things like that.
Right.
So it's been quite an adventure restoring her garden. But we get thousands of visitors every year from all over the world, enjoying that same hospitality that Mary Jo established as her tradition, carrying on her legacy, and just trying to expand her vision, trying to invite more pollinators of more diverse species to visit the property, planting more native plants, very, very important for supporting our native pollinators, including, they say, butterflies and other insects. It's very important to have their larval food plants. So we're expanding within Mary Jo's vision. We're keeping her beautiful salvia garden and even adding new varieties to her salvia garden, but also adding in more flowering plants and more different species to attract more different kinds of pollinators to the garden.
You know, Sherry, listening to you talk from, the beginning of our conversation, it really is amazing how much of a difference individuals can make. And, whether it's the citizen science aspect or, all of these volunteers coming together to keep this, beautiful sanctuary. It really is what you said, that hummingbirds are the gateway drug to conservation and, really to a better world. And I think that your story has really made that vivid and clear for our listeners.
I couldn't agree more with that, Stacey. And one of the things that we do try to emphasize passively and actively with our work at Ash Canyon Bird Sanctuary is that pretty much anybody, anywhere, with any outdoor space, even if it's an apartment balcony, can contribute to wildlife conservation just by planting a few plants, put a few pots on your patio or your balcony. If you have space to garden, even if you're a more traditional gardener who's gardening the more traditional vegetables or ornamentals that most of us expect to find in an average garden, you can tuck a few hummingbird-friendly plants in there. You can tuck in a few food plants for the butterflies, for both nectar and the larvae. Anybody can help. There's a new concept out there. I forget what they're calling it, but basically it's like having a national park all over the country that consists of little pocket habitats.
I love
every little backyard, every little patio can have something that's beneficial to wildlife. And each of us can ensure that at least some wild species can prosper. There's not much that you and I can do to help blue whales or elephants or mountain gorillas or tigers, but we can help those wild species that visit our neighborhoods and our backyard.
Absolutely.
And, step one, of course, is to be an organic gardener, to be very, very judicious about the kinds of pest control you use. Don't use broad spectrum pesticides. Use targeted, focused remedies for things like aphids and caterpillars and grubs and things like that. There are all kinds of things that you can use that are not deadly to other species. They're just going to take care of your one problem. Use barriers as much as you can, like our gopher baskets and repellents. I'm working on a proprietary gopher repellent. It's a witch's brew of all kinds of aromatic stuff. Cayenne pepper, castor oil, garlic, you name it. But it's working. That's the important thing. It's working without us having to kill any gophers. So that's what's important. And just make sure that you are planting the right things in the right ways to help bring in the beneficial wildlife while minimizing your conflicts with wildlife. Salvias are one of those great plants for that, because those aromatic compounds that make salvia such wonderful plants, culinarily, our culinary sage is a salvia. Those kinds of natural chemical defenses are actually pretty good for deterring things like deer and squirrels. So keeping those things in mind and doing companion plantings of some of those kind of stinky plants that critters don't like to eat with your more desirable plants that they do like to eat, that can be a great way to diversify your garden, make it more valuable to wildlife, and minimize your conflicts with wildlife as well.
Well, we love it. And Sherry, we are going to put links to Ash Canyon and all of your other projects on our website, Gardening Simplified on Air. So if anybody does happen to be heading to southeastern Arizona, they can come and see the good work that you are doing there. We want to thank you so very much for joining us today. You shared so much great information, and I know I'm really inspired. I can't wait to get home and watch my hummingbirds.
That's wonderful to hear. I hope all your readers are inspired, because together we can make a difference. Oh. And thank you both so much for having me on. It's been a delight.
Thanks, Sherry.
Thank you, Sherry. A pleasure.
Well, you know what? That's what Gardening Simplified is all about. Doing things that are good for you and good for wildlife, and doing it simply. So
that was inspirational.
It definitely was. So thank you to Sherry. Thank you, Rick. And of course, thanks to Adriana. And thank you so much to all of you for listening. I hope you're inspired to do something in your garden that's a little bit better for wildlife.